There is a word that starts turning up in German battlefield reports in the second half of 1944, and once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. Führerlos. Leaderless. It appears in after-action summaries from Normandy. It appears in interrogation notes from Lorraine. It appears in the Ardennes in December, written in pencil by men who were losing. And here is the strange part. In the German military vocabulary, führerlos was not a neutral description. It was a diagnosis of failure. A leaderless unit was a broken unit. A leaderless unit was a unit that had come apart, that had stopped being an instrument and had become a crowd, that was about to run, or about to surrender, or about to die where it stood. That is what the word meant. That is what it had always meant. So what do you do with it when the leaderless unit is the one that just destroyed your machine gun position? Because that is what those reports are describing. Over and over, in different sectors, in different months, written by officers who did not know each other and were not comparing notes, German commanders describe American infantry that appeared to have no visible leader, no observable command signal, no recognizable formation, and no predictable pattern of movement. Then they describe those same Americans working their way onto a flank they should not have found, at a moment they should not have chosen, with a coordination the report cannot account for. Some of the men writing this were not amateurs. Some had been fighting since Poland. They had watched the French collapse in 1940 and seen Soviet rifle divisions come apart in 1941. They knew what a leaderless enemy looked like because they had made hundreds of them. This did not look like that. This looked like something else, and they had no name for it. That is the mystery I want to work through today. Not who was braver. Not who had better tanks, because that argument has been going in circles for 80 years, and nobody has ever won it. The question is narrower. Why could the army that invented decentralized command, the army that wrote the theory of pushing decisions downward, look through a pair of field glasses at an American rifle squad and fail to understand what it was seeing? The answer is not that Americans were natural warriors. I want to say that early because there is a version of this story that gets told as flattery, and flattery makes bad history. The real answer involves a Prussian catastrophe in 1806, a stupid decision by an American general in a Tunisian ravine, a field telephone bolted to the back of a tank, and a piece of artillery mathematics almost nobody talks about. And it involves something the Germans had built into their own doctrine from the beginning without ever quite admitting it out loud. A ceiling. A point on the ladder below which the thinking was not supposed to happen. Start with the catastrophe. October 1806. The Prussian army marches out to face Napoleon carrying the reputation of Frederick the Great, and within a single day it stops existing. Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same date a few miles apart, broke an army Europe had considered untouchable. Losses in the tens of thousands. Whole fortresses surrendered afterward without a fight, some of them well stocked and barely threatened, because the men holding them could not get an answer from above, and had been trained their entire careers not to move without one. That last detail is the one that mattered. The survivors went looking for the reason and found something uncomfortable. Their army was better drilled than Napoleon's. Their manual of arms was cleaner. Their parade formations were things of mechanical beauty. None of it helped, because the whole structure ran on one assumption, that a plan made at the top would arrive intact at the bottom and be executed exactly as written. Napoleon's marshals were given a purpose and a direction, and left to solve the local problem themselves. When the situation changed, they changed with it, sometimes hours before Paris knew anything had happened. The Prussian response is one of the few times in history you can watch a defeated institution look directly at what killed it and decide to become it. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Clausewitz. A small group of reformers with an unpopular idea. They stripped the army down, opened the officer corps to men without the right surname, and rewrote the relationship between an order and the man receiving it. The principle they landed on is simple and genuinely radical. War is unknowable in detail. The information available to the man at the top is always old, always partial, always slightly wrong. So the man at the top should stop pretending otherwise. He should say what he wants achieved and why, then get out of the way of the man who can actually see the ground. By the 1860s, under Moltke the Elder, it had a name: Auftragstactic. Mission command, more or less, though the translation loses something. Moltke's own writing on this is startlingly blunt for a 19th century field marshal. An order that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood. No plan survives contact with the enemy's main body. So he wrote short orders. He gave the outcome and left the method blank on purpose, because a blank space is harder to misread than a paragraph written by a man 40 miles away. There is a story every German staff officer knew, and I am going to tell it even though you may have heard a version of it, because the punchline is the whole doctrine compressed into one sentence. A Prussian prince is chewing out a major who has made a mess of a maneuver. The major protests that he was obeying his orders. And the prince tells him, roughly, that the king made him a major, because he was expected to know when an order should not be obeyed. Sit with that. That is not a nation of clicking heels and blind obedience. That is an army formally instructing its officers to disobey when an order no longer fits the ground. The obedience demanded was to the intent, not the words. By 1933, all of it was codified in a manual called Truppenführung, still taught in war colleges, and still, honestly, better written than most modern doctrine. War is the province of uncertainty and friction. The commander on the spot must be free to act. Doing nothing is worse than acting and being wrong. And it worked. Poland in 5 weeks. France in 6. American observers watched the Polish campaign and reported that German commanders at every level seemed free to run their own fights with almost no interference from above. Those reports circulated through the U.S. Army, got read, got filed, and most of the American infantry went back to drilling in neat lines. So the Germans had the theory, the manual, the century of practice, and the victories. Which makes 1944 even harder to explain, unless the theory had a floor. Here is what I think gets missed in almost every telling. Auftragstactic was designed for officers. Read Truppenführung closely, and it is talking to a company commander, a platoon leader, a battalion commander. It assumes a professionally educated man with a map, a decision to make, and the authority to make it. The German army trusted that man enormously. It also, quietly, drew a line underneath him. You can see the line in the way the squad was built. A German infantry squad in 1944 was roughly 10 men, and it was not really 10 riflemen. It was a machine gun crew with an escort. The MG-34, later the MG-42, was the center of everything. The gunner was the most important man in the group. The others carried barrels, carried belts, provided security, and moved so the gun could be fed and repositioned. Their rifles were mostly bolt-action Mausers, 5 rounds at a time, weapons for a man supporting somebody else's fire. That structure is efficient. It generates a terrifying volume of fire from very few people. It is also, by design, one decision-making node. The squad leader thinks about where the gun goes. Everyone else exists in relation to the gun. Now the American squad in the same year. 12 men, every one of them carrying an M1 Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, no bolt to work between shots, 1 Browning automatic rifle for a base of fire, and an organization written into the field manuals that split those 12 men into 3 parts. A scout element to find things, a fire element to pin things, a maneuver element to kill things. 3 parts means 3 small decisions running at once inside a group of 12. It means a corporal looking at a hedge bank from an angle his squad leader cannot see, holding a job that requires him to think about it. I do not want to oversell this, because armies are full of manuals nobody reads. But the shape matters. The German squad was built so fire came from one place. The American squad was built so fire came from several, and somebody had to decide, right there, Which of them mattered in the next 30 seconds? Multiply that across a rifle company, and you get a lot of small brains running in parallel. None as well trained as a German equivalent, all of them permitted to act. That is the structure. Structure alone does not win anything. In February 1943, the Americans found that out in the worst way available, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The first serious meeting between the U.S. Army and a German force under a competent commander, and it went about as badly as it is possible for a battle to go without the loss of a country. 5 days. Something around 6,000 American casualties, close to 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Units scattered across dozens of miles of desert, some of them still running when they were found. Equipment left where it stood. The Germans drew conclusions, and their conclusions were contemptuous. Rich country, they said. Fine trucks. Excellent rations. No soldiers in it. What makes Kasserine so useful, though, is not the humiliation. It is the specific reason for the humiliation, because it is the exact mirror of everything I have just been describing. The American commander in that sector was Lloyd Fredendall, and Fredendall had built himself a corps headquarters in a ravine roughly 70 miles behind the fighting, with engineers tunneling into rock to make it safe at a time when those engineers were desperately needed forward. He rarely visited his own front. He scattered his units in penny packets across ground he had never looked at. He bypassed his division commanders and gave orders directly to units far below them, so nobody in the middle of the chain knew what their own men were doing. And he sent those orders in a homemade slang code of his own invention, so mangled that his subordinates sometimes could not work out what he wanted. Read that list again. It is not an American problem. It is a Prussian problem, the 1806 version. A man at the top who believes he can see the whole board, refuses to trust anyone under him, and freezes the entire structure while the enemy moves. The American Army in early 1943 was not naturally decentralized. It was perfectly capable of the same disease that had killed the Prussians. The difference is what happened next. Fredendall was removed. Quietly, with a promotion and a stateside command to spare everyone the embarrassment, but removed. Patton took the corps, then Bradley. And a pattern set in that defined the American Army for the rest of the war. Officers who failed were fired, fast and often. Division commanders, regimental commanders, battalion commanders by the dozen. It was brutal and sometimes unfair, and it worked because the men who survived that filter were disproportionately the ones willing to go forward and decide things themselves. There is another factor people underrate, and it is almost accidental. The American Officer Corps in 1944 was not a professional caste. It could not be. In 1939, the entire U.S. Army was smaller than Portugal's. By 1944, it had 8 million people in it. The arithmetic is impossible. Most officers in a rifle company had been civilians 2 or 3 years earlier. School teachers, insurance men, farmers, kids out of college with 90 days of training. An officer corps like that has no time to build a caste system. There is no century of tradition sitting between the lieutenant and his platoon sergeant, because the lieutenant has been in uniform 11 months, and the sergeant has been in 4 years, and both of them know it. So the lieutenant listens. Not out of humility, out of self-preservation. Add training under Leslie McNair that pushed maneuvers and live fire and problem-solving under stress instead of parade discipline. Add radios down to company level and below, more vehicles than any army on earth, and a supply system that meant a wasted decision was rarely fatal. If you can afford to be wrong sometimes, you can afford to let junior men decide. None of this was a philosophy. Nobody in Washington sat down and decided to reinvent Oftrag's tactic. Most American officers had never heard the word. What happened was cruder and more powerful than a doctrine. Junior men kept acting on their own, the results kept being good, and their superiors kept not punishing them for it. That is a feedback loop, and feedback loops do not need anybody's permission to run. Which brings us to the morning where the whole thing got tested at once. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Just after 6:30 in the morning. The first wave comes down the ramps into water and fire, and inside about 10 minutes the plan for the entire western half of that beach ceases to exist. The specifics are worse than the summary. A tidal current running eastward puts landing craft hundreds of yards off their marks, so companies that trained for one draw arrive in front of a different one with no idea where they are. The bombers dropped long and missed the defenses entirely. Most of the swimming tanks meant to lead the assault sank in the chop. The engineers assigned to blow gaps in the obstacles land scattered, without their equipment, in front of the guns, and lose over 40% before they can do anything at all. And the German unit above the beach was better than intelligence expected. Machine guns of the 352nd Infantry Division were sighted, so they did not fire out to sea at all. They fired sideways, along the sand, so a man wading ashore walked into a beaten zone he could not see the source of. So you have thousands of men behind a shingle bank, soaked, freezing, most of them separated from their officers, many separated from their own units, some without weapons because the rifles went to the bottom with the men carrying them. German training assessments said troops in this condition break. Kill the officers and the body stops. It did not stop. And I want to be careful here, because the version you usually get is a montage. What actually happened was slower, more frightened, and more interesting. It started with individuals talking to whoever was lying next to them. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry walked the shingle telling men, in language that gets cleaned up in some tellings, that two kinds of people were going to stay on that beach, the dead and those about to die, so they might as well move. Norman Cota did the same thing further west, upright through fire because upright was the only way to be seen, gathering knots of men, telling the Rangers along that stretch to lead the way off. A sentence the Rangers kept. Generals doing that is remarkable but not mysterious. The Germans had generals too. What their reports could never place happened lower down. Take one example, the clearest single case on that beach. A section from E Company of the 16th Infantry landed near the Collaville Draw, badly off target under a bluff. Lieutenant John Spaulding was the officer. Technical Sergeant Philip Strechik was the man who mattered. Strechik was a Polish-American from South River, New Jersey. Ordinary work before the war, nothing that would have flagged him at an induction center. By June 1944 he had been through North Africa and Sicily, and had a reputation in the company as the man who knew what to do when everything went wrong. Their section, 30-odd men reduced quickly to fewer, found a fold in the bluff between two German strongpoints. Nobody sent them there. Nobody could have, because nobody above them knew the gap existed. Strechik and a soldier named Bisco went first, working up through mines and scrub, checking, coming back, moving again. Spaulding coordinating, the rest following in a thin file. They reached the top before almost anyone else on Omaha, came in behind the German positions, and started rolling them up from the flank. That is one of the first real penetrations of the German defense on Omaha, and it was executed by a lieutenant with no radio and a sergeant with a rifle, working entirely on their own reading of a piece of ground nobody had briefed them on. Strechik got a Distinguished Service Cross for it. He got another one later. Men who served with him thought he should have had the Medal of Honor. He came home, and like a great many of them, he did not talk about it, and the war stayed with him in ways his family understood only in fragments. That story repeats along 5 miles of sand in different forms all morning. Jimmy Monteith, a lieutenant with the same regiment, walking through open fire to guide 2 tanks through a minefield because the tanks could not see and he could, then leading an assault on the positions above, then getting killed. John Pinder, a technician, a radio man, wounded coming out of the water and going back into it 3 times to drag signal equipment ashore, because without radios nobody was going to be able to coordinate anything at all, then dying while setting it up. Small groups of engineers deciding on their own to stop trying to clear obstacles and start blowing gaps in the wire instead, because the tide had made the first job pointless and the second job was the one that would get men off the sand. None of that was ordered. It could not have been. The command structure that would have issued those orders was lying in the surf. And this is where I want to stop for a second. Because there is something about that morning that bothers me every time I read it, and it is not the violence. It is how little of it got written down. Stretchik we know about because officers survived to write him up. Monteith and Pinder we know about because a citation was drafted and somebody found witnesses. But for every one of those, there were a dozen men who did the same kind of thing in front of nobody who lived, or in front of people who lived, and were too exhausted to file anything, or who assumed somebody else was doing the paperwork. The Army's own historians, going back over Omaha in the months after, kept running into actions that clearly happened and could not be attributed to anyone in particular. A group of men got off the beach at a specific place at a specific time. Somebody led them. The record does not say who. That gap is why I ended up writing a book, and it is linked in the description. Find Your Grandfather's War. It is a working guide to rebuilding an American serviceman's record when almost nothing came down to you. A name. One photograph with nothing on the back. A box of objects nobody ever explained. Morning reports, muster rolls, unit journals, the paper trail he never knew was following him. Most of these men never told the story. The story is still there. Now, back to the ground, because the beach is only the first half of the argument. If Omaha had been the only example, you could dismiss it. Extreme situations produce extreme improvisation. That is not a doctrine, that is desperation. What makes the American pattern real is what happened in the 6 weeks afterward, in terrain that was not chaotic at all. It was orderly, methodical, and completely designed to kill the exact kind of improvisation Omaha had produced. The bocage, Norman hedgerow country. Forget the English idea of a hedge. These were earthen banks, waist-high to head-high, built up over centuries of farmers clearing fields and piling the spoil at the edges, with roots going feet into the soil and thorn scrub growing out of the top. The fields between them were tiny. The lanes were sunken tracks with banks on both sides. Each field was a walled room, and the Germans turned every room into a trap. Machine guns dug into the base of the far bank, sighted to fire along the hedge line rather than across the field. Mortars pre-registered on the gaps. Snipers in the trees. Take a field and you are in the open, and the next field is exactly the same, and there are thousands of them. American infantry went into that in the middle of June, and came out at the end of July having advanced, in some sectors, at a rate you measure in yards a day. Some rifle companies turned over their entire strength more than once. The German reports from that period keep describing the same thing, in remarkably consistent language across different units. They set up in a field. They take fire from the front. Then from a flank, from a position their training says, the Americans should not have known about and could not have reached. They shift to deal with it, and something opens up behind them, because another group has come through the bank 2 fields back, and is now sitting on their line of withdrawal. By the time the situation is legible, it is over. The word the reports reach for is some version of improvised. Unsystematic, not conforming to a recognizable scheme. That is the tell. The officer writing it is not saying the Americans are disorganized. He is saying he cannot find the pattern, and a German officer's entire professional training was about finding the pattern. Read the enemy's actions backward to the intention, then to the order behind the intention, then to the commander who issued it. That is a real skill. It assumes there is a single mind at the far end of the chain. When there are 11 minds and none of them is decisive, the method returns nothing. The 29th Division worked out a drill that spread sideways between units far faster than it moved through any headquarters. A Sherman comes up to the bank and puts its main gun into the corners of the far hedge, where the machine guns will be. A BAR team works the near bank. Engineers blow a hole through the bank so the tank goes through rather than over it, because a Sherman climbing a hedge bank shows its thin belly plate to anyone with a Panzerfaust on the other side. Riflemen go through alongside. Then you do it again in the next field. The clever part was the communication problem. Tank crews buttoned up cannot hear infantry, and infantry cannot get a tank commander's attention without climbing onto a target. So somebody bolted a field telephone to the back of the tank, wired into the crew intercom. Now a sergeant in a ditch could pick up a handset and say, "The gun is in the left corner, 40 yards, put a round in it." That is not technology. That is a phone and some wire. Nobody in Washington had to approve it, and it changed the relationship between armor and infantry at exactly the level where the fighting was happening. The hedge cutter runs the same way. You have probably heard of Curtis Cullen, the sergeant who welded prongs cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of a Sherman so it could punch through a bank. Bradley watched a demonstration in mid-July and ordered them mass-produced, and around 500 were fitted before Operation Cobra opened on the 25th. Here's the detail I find more convincing than the story. Cullen was not alone. Several units reached versions of the same idea at the same time, independently, with different designs and different nicknames. The interesting fact is not that one clever sergeant solved the hedgerows. It is that the army had so many people at the bottom of it trying that the answer turned up in several places at once. That is what a decentralized system looks like from the inside. Not one genius. Many parallel attempts, most of them failing quietly, a few of them working, and a structure loose enough to notice. Now I have been building a case, so let me knock a leg out from under it because there is a piece of this that gets left out, and it changes the shape of the argument. The American army was not decentralized everywhere. In one crucial area, it was the most centralized army in the war, and that centralization is precisely what made all the improvisation survivable: artillery. Through the 1930s, at Fort Sill, the U.S. Army built the Fire Direction Center, one of the great pieces of military engineering of the century, even though it consists entirely of maps, telephones, slide rules, and procedure. Gun batteries stop aiming themselves. Firing data gets computed centrally, so one request can be answered by every gun in range, across multiple battalions, laid so the shells arrive together instead of in a rolling sequence. Time on target. Every round lands in the same few seconds before anyone underneath it has a chance to get down. The part that matters here is who was allowed to ask. A forward observer, often a lieutenant, sometimes a sergeant with a radio, could call for that. Not request it through channels. Call it. Within a couple of minutes, the fire of dozens of guns would land where he said. German artillery generally stayed under tighter control at higher levels, allocated by plan, harder to redirect. Their gunners were skilled. Their machinery was slower. Think about what that means for the private in the hedgerow. American initiative was not merely tolerated, it was underwritten. A junior man could take a risk knowing that if it went wrong, an ocean of steel was 2 minutes away and one radio call from a man he could see. That is what makes a culture of initiative sustainable instead of suicidal. So the honest version of the American system is not that Americans were free-spirited individualists who beat a nation of robots. It is that the Americans decentralized the decisions and centralized the violence, and the Germans were doing something closer to the reverse by 1944. Which brings us to the other half of the mystery. Because everything I have said so far explains how the Americans got good. It does not explain how the Germans got worse at the thing they invented. 2 reasons. The first is arithmetic, and it is savage. Off-Trag's tactic requires a specific kind of officer, experienced, confident, trained for years, and physically forward, because the whole premise is that the man who can see the ground decides. The man who can see the ground is also the man in range. So the doctrine kills its own practitioners first, systematically. Now put that against the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1944, German losses in the East ran into the millions. Junior officers and NCOs died at rates far above their share of the force, precisely because they led from the front, precisely because the doctrine told them to. Every good company commander who exposed himself to read a situation and died reading it was replaced by someone greener, more likely to die quickly or to fall back on whatever the manual said. Which is the exact behavior the manual was written to prevent. You can see it in the units. The division holding the bluffs above Omaha had been formed about 7 months earlier, built around survivors from the east, and filled out with very young men, older men, and people combed out of other services. Its officers had been promoted faster than any peacetime system would have allowed, because there was nobody else. By 1944, that was normal. An army can replace bodies. Replacing 5 years of judgment is a different problem. The second reason is worse, because it was self-inflicted. Oftrag's tactic runs on trust. It only functions if a subordinate believes that using his own judgment will be backed, and that being wrong occasionally is acceptable. Take that away, and the doctrine inverts instantly, because the rational move for any officer becomes waiting for an explicit order that will cover him. Hitler spent the second half of the war destroying that trust thoroughly. The stand-fast orders, the bans on withdrawal without personal authorization, sometimes at absurd levels of detail, the relief of senior commanders for exercising exactly the judgment their own doctrine demanded. Rundstedt sacked and recalled and sacked again. Manstein removed. Every officer in the army could read the lesson. Initiative is a career risk. Compliance is safe. Then July 20th, 1944, the bomb in the briefing room, and whatever was left between the regime and its own officer corps burned down in a week. The consequences were not subtle. The military salute was replaced across the armed forces by the Nazi salute. Himmler took over the replacement army, so the machinery that trained and fed men to the front was now run by the SS. And a program begun in late 1943 expanded sharply. The National Socialist leadership officers, political officers attached to units to guarantee ideological reliability. An army with commissars is an army whose leadership does not trust its own officers. Everyone involved understood that perfectly well, in the same units where a doctrine of independent judgment was still nominally in force. So by late 1944, you have the full inversion. The Germans have the theory and cannot practice it. The Americans have no theory and are practicing it constantly, without a name for what they are doing. And then comes December. The Ardennes offensive opens on the 16th, in fog, against the thinnest part of the American line, with 3 armies and a plan that depended entirely on speed. Get through the American screen, get across the Meuse, take Antwerp, split the Allied armies. The entire thing was a schedule. Every hour of delay was a mile they would not get. What broke that schedule was not a strategic decision. It was small groups of Americans making local choices nobody had authorized. Start at Lanzerath on the northern shoulder on the first morning. Holding a ridge above the village is the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry, 99th Division. 18 men. Their commander is a lieutenant named Lyle Buck, who is 20 years old and has been in the army since he lied about his age at 14. They have inherited foxholes, a few machine guns, and a telephone. That morning, an entire German paratroop regiment starts moving up the road toward them, on the route meant to open the way for the strongest armored spearhead the Germans have. Kampfgruppe Piper. Buck's platoon was not ordered to hold. They were a reconnaissance element, and by any sensible reading they were supposed to report and pull back. Buck reported. What came back was not much help. So he decided that 18 men against a regiment was a delay worth buying, and they stayed. They held most of the day, beating back assault after assault up an open slope. They ran out of ammunition in the late afternoon and were overrun in the dark, most of them wounded, all of them captured. Buch spent his 21st birthday in a German aid station, and the point of the entire northern offensive sat behind that fight for hours it could not afford, on the first day, when the schedule was tightest. The platoon was not decorated until 1981, because the men who could have written it up were prisoners and the paperwork never happened. Then it repeats, all week, with the engineers. The combat engineer battalions in that sector were road builders and mine clearers, not frontline troops, and they became the thin thing between Piper and open country. At Stavelot, on the evening of the 17th, a squad from the 291st under a sergeant named Hensel set a roadblock at the bottom of a hill. Mines across the road, one bazooka, darkness. They stopped the point of a German armored column simply by convincing it the position was held in strength. Piper waited until morning. Another night gone. Then Trois Ponts on the 18th, where engineers blew the bridge over the Amblève with the column in sight, forcing Piper into a narrow valley that stripped away his ability to maneuver. Then Habillement, where another bridge went up as his lead vehicles came into view. He is supposed to have watched it drop and said something about the damned engineers. None of that was part of a comprehensive plan. It was sergeants and lieutenants, and one very good colonel looking at a map, working out which bridge mattered, and destroying government property in front of the enemy without written authority. Meanwhile, on the northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry and artillery held a line that never broke and never got dramatized, because holding is boring, and squeezed the German advance into a narrowing corridor. Down at Bastogne, McAuliffe answered a formal surrender demand with a single word, and the Germans genuinely could not parse it in either language. The offensive died mostly of a lack of hours, and it lost those hours in penny amounts, at road junctions and river crossings, and one ridge above one village, to Americans who did not ask. Now, we know how the Germans thought about all this at the time, and not from memoirs. Memoirs are written for an audience. We know because of a house north of London called Trent Park. British intelligence held captured senior German officers there, and the arrangement was deliberately pleasant. Gardens, decent food, books, orderlies, a sense of dignity. Generals kept their standing and their routines. It felt like a dull country hotel. Every room in it was wired. Bedrooms, drawing rooms, garden benches. In the basement sat listeners, many of them German-speaking refugees, some of them Jewish men who had fled the country these generals served, transcribing day and night for years. The transcripts are the closest thing we have to hearing that generation of German officers think out loud without an audience. What they say about the Americans is the part that interests me, not the version in their public statements. The material superiority comes up, of course, the artillery and the air. But there is a persistent thread of something closer to bafflement about the American soldier as a type. Men they had interrogated who did not behave like soldiers should, who argued, who mocked their own officers in front of a captor, who seemed to hold no reverence for rank at all, and who then, in the field, showed a tactical instinct these officers admitted they could not account for. They circle that contradiction and never resolve it, because in the framework they were raised in, an army of individuals should be a weak army. Individuality was the thing training existed to file down. The Americans were doing it wrong by everything they knew, and getting results anyway. The word they reach for more than once is freedom, and they use it awkwardly, the way you use a word you have been chewing on for months without finding a better one. Not braver. Several of them are explicit that German infantry were the better craftsmen, man for man, and I think they were probably right about that. Not better trained. Freer. As if freedom were a tactical property, which in a narrow sense, in the middle of a hedgerow, it turned out to be. That is what I keep coming back to. These were intelligent, professional men, from an institution that had thought harder about the nature of command than any other in the world, listening to themselves fail to describe what beat them. So here is the answer to the question in those reports. Who is commanding these men? Both nobody and everybody at the same time, and that is not a poetic flourish, it is a structural description. The German officer looking for the command node was performing the correct professional procedure. There was no single node defined. Intent had been distributed so widely, and authority pushed so far down, that the gap between the man who decided and the man who acted had closed to nothing. In a lot of those squads, they were the same person. Their doctrine had a word for one commander and a word for none. It did not have one for 12. And I want to be careful about the verdict, because the flattering version of this story is not quite true. The Wehrmacht was not a bad army in 1944. Man for man, in pure tactical craft, the German rifleman was often better than his American counterpart. Their fire discipline was superb. Their counterattack reflex, hitting back within minutes of losing a position, was faster than anything the Allies managed. The Americans had bad days, badly led units, and moments of panic and stupidity, in the Hurtgen Forest particularly, that nobody should airbrush. The American army was not better because Americans were better. It was better because the system produced more usable decisions per hour at the point where decisions mattered and could absorb the cost of the wrong ones. Some of that was culture. There is something real in the observation that these men came from a country where a 19-year-old had probably already run a tractor, fixed a car with the wrong parts, or worked a job where the boss was not around and the work still got done. That does not make anybody brave. It does make a certain kind of hesitation less automatic. Some of it was accident. A tiny pre-war army that grew too fast to maintain a proper hierarchy. And some of it, the part nobody plans, was the willingness to let it happen. Officers who watched sergeants do things they had no authority to do and decided not to make an issue of it because it worked. That is the whole mechanism, not a doctrine. 100,000 small non-interventions. The Germans spent 140 years writing the theory and never got the last rung of the ladder. They trusted their captains completely and their privates conditionally, and then a political system spent 2 years teaching every officer in the army that thinking for yourself could get you killed by your own side. The Americans wrote almost nothing down, drew no ladder at all, and let the bottom rung do the thinking. There is one more thing I want to leave you with, and it is not about doctrine. Almost none of the men in this story thought they were an example of anything. Strecek went home and worked and did not talk about it. Buck's platoon spent decades assuming the army had never noticed. The engineers who blew those bridges did not learn until much later what their afternoon had cost the German offensive. The privates in the hedgerows who worked out where the machine gun was and went and dealt with it are mostly anonymous and always will be, because the only witnesses were the men beside them, and those men are gone too. The Germans in that country house never landed on the right word, and I am not sure I have either. What they were watching was not a formation. It was 10 or 12 men who had each concluded, separately, that whatever needed doing next was theirs to do, and who did not need anyone's permission to get there, because nobody had ever taught them to wait for it. There was no code to break. That is the part the Germans could not accept. They kept looking for the hidden order, the concealed signal, the man in charge somewhere off to the side. There wasn't one. Just a squad, in a field, deciding. If your father or grandfather served, I would rather read about him in the comments than almost anything else. Unit, theater, one thing he said or never said. Those fragments are the only version of this history nobody has edited. And if this was worth your time, the like button helps it reach people who care about getting it right. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are a lot of these stories, and most of them belong to men who assumed nobody would ever come looking.